So we're in the old operating theatre museum, and next door is the Herb Garret. And this was actually built as an operating theatre for women in 1822 as part of St Thomas's Hospital. The women's ward was actually alongside the Herb Garret, and that's why this became the women's operating theatre. And you can see why it was called an operating theatre, because it has this stepped viewing arrangement above it from which the students could watch the procedures taking place on the table down here. This particular operating theatre would have been quite an unpleasant place to visit, either as a spectator or as a patient. It was a working site from 1822 to 1862, which meant that it didn't see either antiseptic developments come in or anaesthesia. So this would have been a pretty brutal, bloody, noisy, smelly, disgusting place. You'd have most likely been dosed with sort of alcohol or some kind of sedative, maybe given a large wooden pole to bite on to kind of stop you from screaming or thrashing around. And a common form of surgery, amputation, for example, would have taken all of 1 minute to actually remove the necessary limb or digits or whatever it was going to be. This being a women's ward, prenatal and obstetric related operations would have likely have been common, and that was a particularly unpleasant procedure, as we'll see from some of the tools and devices used for removing troublesome fetuses next door. So there would have been a pretty unpleasant pall hanging over this place at any given time. But the place was also used as an educational centre, so students would often have been here to watch, I would imagine, to watch bodies being dissected. And interestingly, this whole region of Southwark was well known as the home of the Borough Boys, who were a particularly notorious group of body snatchers. And it wasn't until 1832 that the body snatching laws came into effect. So for a good 10 years, it's quite likely that the bodies being dissected here had been pinched from neighbouring churchyards, perhaps even been the victims of murders by the Borough Boys themselves. So this is an account from the Lancet from April 1824, and documents the unfortunate story of Elizabeth Reagan, aged 60, who was admitted to the hospital on the 19th of April 1824 with a compound fracture of tibia and fibula after being hit by a large carriage, presumably somewhere nearby. Now, for several days, Elizabeth was just left in a bed and watched by the doctors, who noted that her condition was worsening despite it just being a minor fracture. So fearing that she might die, it was decided 10 days later that she should be operated upon. And so she'd have been brought into this very room, and this is what happened from the Lancet. 30th of April 1894. Patient rather weaker than yesterday. At 1:30 o'clock, she was brought into the female operating theatre to undergo the operation. The tourniquet being applied and the artery in the groin compressed well, an assistant supported the limb while the operator proceeded to amputate about 3 inches above the knee joint. The usual steps of the operation having been completed, great care was taken that as little blood as possible should be lost. 3 vessels were soon secured, the wound was dressed, and the patient removed from the theatre in 20 minutes from the time she was first brought in. About 4 ounces of blood were lost. During the operation, the patient was quite faint, as you might imagine she would be, and brandy and wine were administered, which revived her a little. On examining the severed limb, it was found an oblique fracture of the tibia and fibula about 3 inches above the ankle joint, together with extensive laceration of the integument, skin, extending from 2 inches below the head of the tibia to the inner malleus, ankle bone. No attempt at union of the bone had been set up. So this was quite a minor injury by our standards. You would expect to be in and out of hospital in an afternoon, I would think, with something so small. But in Elizabeth Reagan's case, this resulted in first amputation of the leg above the knee, and then, sadly, a few days later, she gradually sank and died. Her body was not examined.
This is Bunhill Fields. We're about a few minutes away from the London's Square Mile. It's the leading nonconformist cemetery for London. It was opened in 1657 and was closed in the mid-19th century. Nonconformists were people who were not members of the Church of England. So that includes Baptists, Quakers, Methodists, Presbyterians. If you were not a member of the Church of England, you would not want to be or could be buried in a churchyard in this country. So you would be buried here, and actually there's about 130,000 people who were buried in Bunhill Fields over the years, and they include Isaac Watts, John Bunyan and William Blake. The real reason we're here is to see Daniel Defoe's last resting place, and Daniel Defoe was the author of the Journal of the Plague Year, which is what this walk is about. The Journal of the Plague Year recounts the suffering of Londoners during the Great Plague of 1665. Daniel Defoe actually was only 5 at the time of the Great Plague. So what we see in the Journal of the Plague Year is a man looking back at the past to put together a wonderful testament of the Great Plague through the eyes of one man who we only know from his initials, which are HF. It records a time in London's history where everyone was involved in a true horror. 100,000 people died from the plague, it's estimated, though Daniel Defoe does say in the Journal of the Plague Year that the figures probably are an underestimate. Defoe did go to the original documents and use his journalistic skills to knit together fiction with fact, and that's what makes the Journal of the Plague Year so interesting.
As our 18th century medical student walked up from Blackfriars past Newgate Prison to lectures or to watch an operation at St Bartholomew's, he might have found himself asking why London's most prestigious teaching hospital, why its oldest hospital, was standing right next to the city's most unpleasant, smelly, noisy meat market, Smithfield. The answer to this question tells us a great deal about the changing status of hospitals in London's history. Smithfield, which is where I'm standing now, began life as the Smooth Field, outside the walls of the medieval city of London, and it was here that a meat market has taken place for about the last 1,000 years of London's history. This site has been the place of much butchery, both animal and human, because this was the place of a great deal of execution. The Scottish patriot or terrorist, whichever you prefer, William Wallace, Braveheart, was hung, drawn and quartered here. And during the Counter-Reformation in the reign of Mary I, Bloody Mary, many Protestants were burned at the stake on this site. This is not the obvious place for a major teaching research institution. This is not the place you might want to come if you were feeling sick and wanted to get better. But on the other hand, this tells us a great deal about the status of early hospitals, the place they had in medieval society. All of London's early hospitals were, in essence, priories. They were religious institutions run by monks and nuns, not by doctors. Now, the Priory Hospital of St Bartholomew at Smithfield, which is what you can see behind me, was founded in 1123 by Rahere. Rahere has been variously described as a jester, a courtier, or a knight. In 1123, he took a pilgrimage to Rome to repent of his sadly unspecified sins. He approached Rome from the south by, like many pilgrims, passing through the notoriously unhealthy Pontine marshes. He was bitten by a mosquito, he caught malaria. When he entered Rome, he came down with a nasty malarial fever. He was taken to pray at the chapel of St Bartholomew on an island in the Tiber. He fell into a deep sleep after prayers had been said, and a vision of St Bartholomew appeared to him. Bart promised to restore him to health, and in return, Rahere would build a priory hospital to look after the poor and the sick of his own city. Rahere returned to London, petitioned the king for a site on which to build this hospital. The site he was given was not an attractive one, caught between the medieval city walls and the city's largest meat market, Smithfield. The hospital Rahir built was initially very, very small, a prior, 8 monks and 8 nuns. The idea being that while 8 of the staff were treating the patients, the other 8 would be out collecting money, collecting alms for the running of the hospital. And the hospital proceeded in this way for 200, 300, 400 years. The next major change in Bart's history came in the 1530s with the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, because Bart's was basically a religious institution, a priory, it was scheduled for closure by Henry's commissioners, but the city authorities decided that it was very useful to have a hospital around for dealing with the poor and the sick, and they petitioned Henry to keep it open. This he did, and this fact is commemorated by a statue of Henry VIII standing over the gatehouse of the hospital, one of the very few public statues of this rather unpopular king anywhere in Britain. After the Reformation, the hospital became much more medical in character. It started to call in leading surgeons, physicians from around the city who would come and treat the poor for 1 day or 2 days a week for no money. This is the origin of the idea of the consultant, somebody who lives off his private work and does hospital work as a charity, as a demonstration of piety and wealth. So by the mid-18th century, the time that our medical student was coming here, Bart's, like so many of London's major hospitals, Guy's, St Thomas's, was a centre not only for surgery, not only for treating patients, but increasingly a centre for medical education.
We're in Greenwich on the River Thames, between Greenwich and Deptford, and behind us on the River Thames was where in the 19th century the Dreadnought Hospital ship was moored between the 1830s and the 1870s. The hospital ship was set up by the Seamen's Hospital Society, which was created in the 1820s, to look after the welfare of sailors. And these ships were a place where sailors could be quarantined and treated for diseases, and put back into health and put back into service on the ships that came into London. The ships also served as a place of protection for the rest of London. The sailors, if they were quarantined here, would not be a danger to the public of London. The ships themselves were ex-warships from the British Navy, hulks with their moorings and masts taken down. And one of the early problems for the society was really sort of reassuring people of the presence of the hospital ship on the Thames, due to the fact that hulks in those days were closely associated with transportation of prisoners to Australia. The hulks were where they were kept before journeying off to Australia. So from the 1830s, when the first hospital ship was put in place on the Thames here, to 1872, when the last ship was taken away, for 40 years these ships existed, these hulks were moored here to treat sailors from all nations. Intriguingly, the tropical diseases people perhaps feared that they'd be treated for was maybe not the most cases they had on board the boats. When they did have cholera outbreaks, they would have separate ships where the sailors could be quarantined. But what really was treated by the sailors who were on board these boats was things like scurvy, venereal diseases, injuries at sea really when falling off masts and so on. But the sailors were treated on these ships, patched up, then set off to sail again. In the 19th century, London was arguably the busiest port in the world, and the Thames, as a result, was a tremendously busy river. In the 19th century then, the river would have been noisy, would have been tremendously busy, an odd place then for a hospital ship to be moored. The contemporary accounts don't talk much about this, though you have to imagine that it would have been not necessarily the pleasantest place for people to be treated, but this is where the ship was moored. The original hospital ship that's established in the 1830s is HMS Grampus, and it's replaced later by HMS Dreadnought. And that name catches on, and it's by the Dreadnought name that the hospital ships get known. So much so that when the Dreadnought is replaced, the next hospital ship that comes in its place is retitled the Dreadnought to keep awareness of it, because it's become the popular name for the hospital. The hospital ships were here for 40 years. In 1872, the last hospital ship was taken to Deptford to the Breakers Yard as a land hospital had been built to replace the hospital ship. In the 1890s, a branch of the hospital was set up near Royal Albert Dock, across the Thames, near where London City Airport is now. That hospital, in turn, 9 years later, became the site of the first London School of Tropical Medicine. And it's where tropical training in medicine really kick-started and established itself, and really became an important part of the British Empire's operation and the British Empire's attitude to medicine. I think what's really interesting about the Dreadnought story and the story of the hulks here on the Thames is that it's the missing factor from Greenwich's maritime and medical history. The Royal Observatory is still there, the Naval Hospital still stands, but the hulks have long gone. But what has remained is the education and learning and School of Tropical Medicine in London.
This is one of the most famous landmarks in London medical history. This pump right here, where on Broadwick Street in Soho, which in 1854 was Broad Street, in the middle of the slums and rookeries which constituted Soho at that time. And on the 8th of September 1854, on the instructions of the Dr. John Snow, the handle to this pump was removed so that water could no longer be drawn from it, because Snow had recognised that this pump, the water from this pump, was the source of the outbreak of cholera that had been ravaging Soho, killing over 500 people in the previous weeks. Cholera had first arrived in London in 1831. It had swept across from Asia. It was an absolutely terrifying disease, very, very rapid in its progress, very indiscriminate in who it attacked. And cholera epidemics were brief but extremely intense. Cholera was a horrifying disease with incredibly rapid onset. The first thing you knew about it was terrible stomach cramps and diarrhea, and then you'd quite often die, often the same day, just in a pool of your own stinking excrement. The prevailing theory at the time was that filth diseases, like cholera as they were called, infectious and contagious diseases, were spread by a general miasma, a general pollution of the atmosphere, which might sort of emanate from the ground or be part of the air, or be spread in any number of ways. People would try and protect themselves against them by inhaling sweet-scented things and so on. This was actually the framework within which John Snow himself was working. It would be another generation before Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, and the idea that these diseases were actually spread by germs and bacteria. So Snow still believed that cholera was being communicated by a miasma, but he believed that the miasma was particularly concentrated in the water supply. So this legendary moment is commemorated not only by this pump here, but also by a pub, the John Snow. So this is the John Snow. It's full of John Snow memorabilia. And it even has a part of the legendary pump handle that was removed. It was only renamed the John Snow quite recently, and it's a symbol, I guess, in that sense, of how the legend of John Snow's story has grown with the years. And as is often the case with medical and scientific breakthroughs, the story that's accreted around it isn't quite, nothing is quite as it seems, and nothing is quite the way it was. The site of the pump, for example, is not actually the site of the pump. The pump was actually over here, much closer to the pub, a few yards down the road. The version of the John Snow story that we hear these days is that by removing the handle from the Broad Street pump, he saved countless lives in the middle of a cholera epidemic. That by identifying the water in the pump as the cause of contagion, he moved away from traditional theories of sort of miasma and kind of general pollution and towards modern theories of germs and bacteria and infection. And finally, that it was John Snow's work in this that became the main impetus for the extraordinary revolution in London's sanitation that would happen in the next decade with Joseph Bazalgette's enormous project to remodel London's sewers. What was really original about John Snow's work, what was really groundbreaking, was the statistical method behind it. He started plotting the locations of all the deaths in the cholera epidemic, and he discovered that they all clustered around water pumps, and particularly around this pump in Broad Street. He then investigated the people living in these slums around Broad Street and found that the people who were least affected were the brewery workers, because they were drinking beer rather than water. So John Snow's statistical work was groundbreaking, but actually this great moment when the pump handle was taken off the pump had very little effect. It was largely symbolic, because by the time he'd managed to persuade the parish to remove the pump handle, the cholera epidemic had pretty much burnt itself out anyway, so it's unlikely that he saved any lives. And also the idea, which is frequently now attached to his story, that this was a pivotal moment in the campaign to revolutionise London sanitation, is also unfortunately not true. Snow's report, when he finally produced it, gathered very little attention at the time. But John Snow's work, as would be recognised with hindsight, was a very important contribution to a public health movement that had been building in London since cholera had arrived in the early 1830s. So the real significance of John Snow's story is that it's the birth of epidemiology, it's the birth of statistical analysis, and it shows how many lives you can save and how much you can improve conditions with proper statistical surveys. But of course, this is something we recognise clearly now, but wasn't recognised at the time. So John Snow, although he went on and made other pioneering medical discoveries, never really lived to see his work on the Broad Street pump come to any sort of practical fruition. But then, on the other hand, he did achieve the great accolade that Londoners give to their own, which is to have a pub named after him.
We're here in Chelsea, in the Chelsea Physic Garden. We're about midway between King's Road and the River Thames, and this is the garden of the Society of Apothecaries, which was founded in 1673. They were originally leasing this land as a nice place by the river at a time when Chelsea was just a small village quite a long way outside London, and they noticed that the climate here was a microclimate due to the proximity of the water, that it was actually very, very good for growing things that might not otherwise survive in England. So they built a wall around it to protect it even further, and they started growing lots and lots of herbs. The purpose being, let's teach apprentices who are learning to be apothecaries, let's teach them to recognise the various plants that exist. Hans Sloane was an enormously rich man at the start of the 18th century. He collected a great many things, and his collection eventually formed the basis of the British Museum in 1753. But 3 decades before that, he bought this ground. It was 4 acres. He bought it from a man named Cheney, who Cheney Walk, just along the way, is named after. And he gave it, he leased it in perpetuity to the Society of Apothecaries, who had been on this ground for 50 years. He basically said, okay, you can have it for as long as you like. I just want £5 a year, which is what they still pay, and I want 50 good herbal samples for the Royal Society every year, up until we have, I think, 2,000 of them. And they long ago exceeded that. In fact, by the end of the 18th century, they'd exceeded that total. And by the 18th century, it was the most significant centre of these studies, pretty much anywhere that one, certainly in this country. In days when travel, even travelling up to York, regardless of what they say Dick Turpin was supposed to have been able to do on a horse, basically a journey that we take for granted in this country, relatively short, 2-hour train journey. In the 18th century, very difficult to do. So to have in London, which by that century was certainly the largest city in the Western world and the centre of the world's trade, it was pretty much the most important centre in the world. So to have these things available for study for people interested in medicine, scientists, that sort of thing, rather than, oh well, there might be an interesting plant halfway up, you know, in the Andes or something. You could die getting there. I mean, just going on a sea voyage was a very risky business. You might not survive that for all sorts of reasons. So it wasn't just showing off to be able to say, we have an olive tree here, this far north, and we can grow olives, and you don't have to go to Italy to get it, or whatever it might be. Because of the seed program, once it had a remarkable collection of different kinds of plants, they began taking something that might grow very well in this country or that country and saying, oh, it would do extremely well in another continent entirely, let's plant it there. And in the 1730s, a friend of Hans Sloane, whose name was Overbury, he was involved in Georgia, in what was then obviously a British colony in the southern states of America, and they were trying to get things to grow. And Hans Sloane shipped out from the Physic Garden some cotton, and that was the origins of the entire cotton industry in the southern states of America. We have rubber being taken from Brazil and being established in Malaysia and Sri Lanka. That was rubber from the Chelsea Physic Garden. And then possibly the most famous case, in 1848 they were able to take tea from China to India and established it in Assam. The gardens in themselves, it's no accident they started out by a river, partly because of the climate, but also they were interested from the beginning in making contact with other countries. London, the most significant port in the world in those days, and so very quickly you could get out onto the trade routes. Why would they want to transplant tea, for instance, from the in 1848 from China to India? Because the British Empire, we didn't own China, but in those days we were running India and had been since the 18th century when the East India Company had been looking after it. And it was indeed one of the people from these gardens who then went to work for the East India Company who did that transplanting of tea at that time. So very significant things were coming from this sort of hothouse enclave here in these few acres